The LBJ Museum of San Marcos presents Debate Night with Texas State University's LBJ Debate Society and the University of North Texas debate team. Tonight's proposition, for or against, abolish the Electoral College. This program was recorded via Zoom on October 26, 2020. The Lyndon Baines Johnson Museum of San Marcos is a mission-driven, not-for-profit organization that explores how his early years in Central Texas influenced the landmark legislation of the 36th President of the United States and the impacts of that legislation on our lives today. To support programs like this one, please visit www.lbjmuseum.com to make a one-time donation or become a member. Thanks.
Literary societies have a long history of meeting in debates. In fact, in 1879, the Sam Houston Normal was established, but by 1907, San Marcos, Southwest Texas Normal, had already challenged North Texas Normal to an official debate between the two colleges. And there's actually a long history of these normal schools debating one another. Sam Houston Normal, East Texas Normal, the North Texas Normal, the Southwest Texas Normal, and the West Texas Normal, which, by the way, all five of these colleges still exist. They are Texas State, Texas A&M Commerce, North Texas, and West Texas A&M. They all exist. They're evolved in a number of ways for them to be able to have meetings and to be able to compete against one another. This was a regular event. Let me read just one short excerpt from a match that they had in 1909. The San Marcos School brought along 23 men, students for the festivities. The Oratorical Association was to host a reception with music and the band. During the evening program, a trio club, the Orpheus Octet, and the Octet of Strings provided music. The day was a round of dinners, carriage drives, receptions, banquets, etc. The rivalry blossomed rapidly, outdoing anything that athletic competition yet had to offer. That excerpt, which was found in the Normal Schools Gazette, actually tells us that debating outside of the classroom was a much more popular engagement than any of the athletic events that happened, and that there were days filled with dinners. I'm looking forward to those dinners when we get back down to San Marcos. We'll have plenty of those, I'm sure. Well, by 1920, many of the normal schools had changed their names to the teachers' colleges that they were known as around that era. But what didn't change was the focus on debate. As Dr. Kramer said, Lyndon Baines Johnson was a debater at Southwest Texas Normal. In fact, he is famously written for participating in a debate in 1928 against Sam Houston Normal, in which he and his partner Elmer Graham were victorious on a 2-to-1 decision, beating Sam Houston on the topic, the U.S. should cease to protect capital investments in foreign countries after declarations of war. Did you hear that? 34 years before there was a Vietnam era, they were debating the topic, whether or not we should protect capital investments in foreign countries after declarations of war. These normal schools really were doing incredible things to democratize the students and the student body. And the impact that the normal schools had on their students, it left a lasting generation, not only impacting their students, but then those teachers. And I should remind you that right after his participation in the college at Texas, Southwest Texas Teachers College at that time, LBJ went on to teach at a primarily Mexican-American high school for a short period of time. He noted afterwards that the debate itself was a glorious occasion, and the commentary in the newspaper read, every courtesy was extended by the debaters and the coach, and each person only had feelings of gratitude and appreciation. I think back on the debates that we've seen between the presidential candidates in these last few weeks, and I wonder if they could say the same thing, that each person only had feelings of gratitude and appreciation. Well, a lot of things has changed, but one thing that hasn't changed is the importance of debate and discussing issues that are central to our country. And that tradition continues. And I'm very, very glad that students from North Texas can participate in this event tonight. And it harkens back to that first challenge match in 1907. And we'll see if we can keep up the discussion and if afterwards everyone can have feelings of gratitude and appreciation. Thanks very much for having us here this evening.
Thank you, Brian. And I have feelings of gratitude and appreciation for you for doing that for us. I really appreciate that. So our debate this evening is that the United States should abolish the Electoral College. Our two teams that we have debating for you today are, of course, the University of North Texas and Texas State University. Our visitors from the University of North Texas will be on the negative. They will be advocating not abolishing. And I would like to introduce them now. Alex De La Rosa and Jose Sanchez. You can applaud virtually. And then the Texas State team that we will have debating on the affirmative, Jacob Everett and Hannah Nunley. Yay, Bobcats. Our format is a very simple format. What we will do is each of the debaters will have a 6-minute speech. Now, that 6-minute speech will be subject to what we call points of information. After their first minute, you may hear me say POI or something along those lines to indicate that members of the other team can raise their hand to ask a point of information. The speaker can either accept that point or they can decline it. 1 minute prior to the end of their speech, I will give them another point POI, 1 minute mark, and they will know then that they're now back in protected time. Okay? After the 4 6-minute speeches, we will then throw it open to the audience where you can make floor speeches, not to exceed 2 minutes. And so I'll ask you all to turn back on your videos at that point, and we will then ask for those particular speeches. After those are concluded, each side will then have a 4-minute rebuttal, beginning with the negative and then the affirmative. And then at the end of the debate, I will release the poll and you will either vote to abolish the Electoral College or not. Okie doke. So without any further ado, I call upon Jacob Everett from Texas State University to begin the case for the affirmative.
All right, before I start, I'd like to thank the LBJ Museum for hosting us. I'd like to thank UNT for deciding to come down and debate us, even though it's over Zoom. And I'd like to thank everyone who decided to come out and watch the debate today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to start off with some background. Daryl West reported for the Brookings Institute that the Electoral College was created as a way to outsource major influence on the chief executive away from both the federal government and state legislatures. This third-party system is constantly justified through arguments like the tyranny of the majority and federalism. However, its practice has been less than stellar. The National Conference of State Legislatures, or the NCSL, says that the Electoral College betrayed the popular vote in 1824, 1876, 1888, 1960, 2000, and our most recent presidential election in 2016. The Electoral College is a system that's ingrained in our political culture and has led to several controversies. Keeping all of this in mind, we stand strongly affirm the Electoral College should be abolished because it encourages strategic campaigns based on swing states. It encourages a lack of representation, and abolishing the Electoral College is something that people would like. Firstly, though, we have to look at the swing states. The Electoral College makes the election come down to just a few battleground states. In fact, only over 90% of campaigns take place in just 11 states. The Electoral College makes few states more important to campaigns, and it causes candidates to avoid campaigning in other states. Richard Hansen, a professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, told the Harvard Gazette on October 21st of 2019 that there hasn't been a major rally in the past few months of a campaign by candidates that aren't swing states since 2000. This means that candidates are no longer running on a campaign based on policies and foreign affairs. They're making strategic decisions as if they're playing a game of risk. It's based completely along the lines of how many blue states there are and how many red states there are, not who has the best policies or who should actually be president. There's a huge problem with this method of electing candidates because it creates a low voter turnout. NPR reported on November 26th of 2016 that battleground states have the highest voter turnouts. They put out a few reasons for this. One, voters are told to vote more than those who aren't in swing states. Door knockers, ads targeted towards increasing turnout, and more tactics are aimed at increasing turnout specifically in these states, but not in states that aren't called battleground states. The second reason is that voting is more convenient in swing states. Things like same-day voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, and even mail-in voting have historically been reserved for swing states and swing states only. And the third reason is that voters are just more likely to be discouraged from voting in non-swing states. Voters are less likely to show up to the ballot because if they're sure that their electors are going to vote one way or the other. Now that we've looked specifically through, how swing states create low voter turnout, we can analyze the representation question whenever it comes to the Electoral College. The Electoral College doesn't properly represent America. This is obvious from the several elections that we've had with presidents who lost a popular vote, but not the election, especially in the most recent elections of 2000 and 2016. Christopher Pearson, a Vermont senator on the board of National Popular Vote, told the NCSL that things like winner-take-all laws that give all of the electors in a single state to one candidate means that only almost 70% of Americans aren't given proper representation in the presidential race. Faithless electors also heavily contribute to this. In the Darrell West article that I pointed out from Brookings earlier, he said that electors can vote whichever way they like, and it was even upheld in a court in 2016 that electors could vote whichever way that they'd like. It doesn't matter how people vote in the popular vote. This was after 7 electors defected, which means that there's less representation than what there should be in our presidential election. This poor representation has led to disaster presidencies full of unhappy constituents and bad policies that go against what the majority of Americans want. This is especially evident in the past election. Clinton won the popular vote by almost 1 million votes, but Trump ended up winning the election, and Trump has had more controversies and even an impeachment, which is a pretty good sign that maybe the popular vote would have been the way to go. This is less democratic, which is the big problem with poor representation. There's a tremendous lack of representation has led to a loss of democracy. It's no longer each person's ballot that decides who represents them in government, but instead it's several people who vote on who they'd like to become president. This means that every 4 years, 538 people become the most influential people in America. This makes it fully possible that your vote will not count. Looking past representation, we can look at abolishing the Electoral College as something that's popular. In fact, the Brookings Institute article that I keep referencing says that as early as 1967, 58% of Americans favored a popular election over the Electoral College. And again in 2019, Politico took another poll that had a majority of respondents requesting a popular vote as well. It's entirely, knowing all of
this. 1 minute left.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Keeping all of this in mind, it's entirely possible for us to abolish the Electoral College. We can amend the Constitution. It's not hard. The Constitution has been amended before. So, knowing all of this, understanding how representation in swing states affect not only voter turnout, but democracy as we know it, and how it threatens each of those. Knowing that citizens in America actively want a popular vote over the Electoral College, and knowing that the Electoral College is just something that's that's ingrained in our political culture only because we put it there, not because it's something we can't get rid of. It's very easy to see why we should abolish the Electoral College. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those remarks. And I now call upon Alex De La Rosa to begin the case for the negative.
Yeah, first I'd like to get some thank yous out of the way. I'd like to thank Texas State for hosting this practice tournament. I'd like to thank our opponents in this debate for coming out and debating us today. I'd like to thank our debate coaches for prepping us for this debate. And I'd like to thank LBJ himself for providing me the first quote in my speech. So with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and begin. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson was quoted in saying, quote, "Our present system of computing and awarding electoral votes by states is an essential counterpart of our federal system and the provisions of our Constitution which recognize and maintain our nation as a union of states. Today, I will determine one big disadvantage of moving to a national popular vote and then propose a potential alternative and address some points that they bring up about the Electoral College." So I'd like to pose one question first. Elections are supposed to be for the people, right? They're supposed to represent the people, correct? But who are these people? According to the Washington Post, there's an estimated 16 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Furthermore, there's 6 million African Americans who are unable to vote due to their felony status in a racist justice system, and a large number of mentally incapacitated people who are not able to vote. Is there any way that voices can be captured? Well, yes, it's actually the Electoral College. Now, how do we do this? Well, first, the Electoral College votes are actually determined by the census. The census determines the total amount of electorates by population size, which includes undocumented persons, felons, the mentally incapacitated, and who are all groups of people who are not allowed to vote. The framers of the Constitution recognize that people who aren't allowed to vote still contribute to and are affected by our country's decisions. According to the Washington Post, Donald Trump tried to remove undocumented immigrant populations from being counted in the census. Now, why would he do this? Well, while undocumented immigrants can't vote, their impact is still felt in determining electoral college numbers. The same applies for felons and the mentally incapacitated. At a time when there is a mass division, we do not need more nationalistic rhetoric about who is and isn't a citizen and who is and isn't able to vote. Now, the Electoral College isn't perfect. We'll be the first to admit it. But the beauty of our Constitution is that it is open to change. So is there a better way to do things? Is there a better way that actually exists? One that exists in Maine or Nebraska, maybe? Well, if the answer were no, then this wouldn't be a particularly good debate, but there is, so that's the good news. So what's our proposed alternative? Well, I'd like to map this out by using Texas as an example, right? So Texas currently has 38 electoral votes, 36 of which are derived from the House of Representatives and 2 of which are derived from the Senate. So the way our plan would work is that there would be 36 individual elections in Texas for each district, and the person who wins that district wins that electoral vote, and this would provide a better allocation of electoral votes. And the remaining two electoral votes will be given to the person who wins the overall state popular vote. Like I said, this already exists in Nebraska and Maine. Now, there are a few benefits of this, right? The first is federalism. Yes, go ahead.
So your counter advocacy, you talk about how there's a big disadvantage to the popular vote. How does your counter advocacy allow the groups you discuss to vote?
Well, it doesn't give them the right to vote. However, it does give them more representation, right? If we move to a popular vote that only allows for citizens and to be represented through their votes directly, we lose a lot of the representation that they could potentially have, right? Because of the fact that the census accounts for undocumented immigrants and these other groups of people, we're more able to allocate electoral votes more in a better way than in a better way that allows these people to have an impact on the election. Now, moving on to the benefits, right? The first is that of federalism, right? We need a mechanism to actually give out these elections, right? And the states are that mechanism. According to a report by Pepperdine University, the Electoral College retains the power of states to administer elections and more specifically to determine voter eligibility. As presently constituted, the Electoral College includes a mechanism that accounts for voters and non-voters alike. The second benefit is that we're able to address this issue of invisible populations. Since the allocation of electoral college votes are on a state-by-state level, it's more representative of the overall population of those states, which includes immigrants, felons, and the mentally incapacitated. The interests of these people are more likely to be represented if there's better allocation of electoral votes. And the third is that of ruralism. Yeah, go ahead.
These groups of people that you're saying are properly represented by the Electoral College, how well were they represented in the last election?
In the sense that they impact the amount of electoral votes that each state gets, right? So without the Electoral College votes, they have no weight in our election system, and that's ultimately what we're trying to solve. Now, some of the benefits of our plan is that it actually solves some of the political engagement because people are more likely to vote if they feel like they're actually going to be represented. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that people actually just want to be represented. And and when it comes to the disproportionate representation about the person not winning the national vote, our plan solves this because there's a better allocation of electoral votes that are more tied to the popular vote than the current system. Now let's move on to the first few points that our opponents make. First, they say that the Electoral College, go ahead.
1 minute remaining.
Okay, sorry. First, they say that politicians don't campaign in states with the Electoral College the same way they would with a popular vote. However, this is just politics, right? Politicians are not always getting into the motion of policy that impacts their constituents. They're more concerned with looking good and strategizing how to win elections. This doesn't go away with removing the Electoral College, right? All you have to do is look at an episode of Parks and Rec and notice that a politician is more considered about how they can win and how they look in order to win those votes. And then going on to representation, they say that there's no proper representation with the Electoral College. However, our plan solves for this, right? Because of the fact that the Electoral College votes are allocated in a more proportional way, we're actually going to be able to have a system where the person who wins the popular vote is going to be able to win the Electoral College well, and we actually get a lot of the benefits of the Electoral College that we demonstrated. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those remarks. And I now call upon Hannah Nunley to continue the case for the government.
Okay, I'm starting my time now. On August the 6th of 1965, then President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. This provision guaranteed African Americans the right to vote and made it illegal to impose restrictions on federal, state, and local elections that were designed to deny the vote to African Americans. This act allowed more representation for Americans. The same way that the Voting Rights Act made the voting system more representative of the United States, Jacob and I proudly affirm that the United States should abolish the Electoral College. First, I'll go ahead and add on another point to the points that Jacob discussed in his first speech. This point's about third parties. In spite of the founders' intentions, the United States in 1800 became the first nation to develop political parties organized on a national basis to accomplish the transfer of executive power from one faction to another via an election. The United States Embassy, in an article titled "Role of Political Parties," stated that in recent decades, the amount of individual voters who classify themselves as independents has risen substantially. The requirements of the Electoral College make it extremely difficult, nay, impossible, for a third-party candidate to win the presidency because the individual states' electoral votes are allocated under a winner-take-all arrangement. These winner-take-all arrangements stifle the ability of third-party candidates to gain legitimacy due to the way that the Electoral College favors the two-party system. This would not go away under the counter-advocacy that the negation UNT proposes. Unfortunately, with electors still in place, third parties are still stifled of their ability to gain legitimacy. Let's look at the arguments that UNT puts on the case that Jacob gives you. First, we tell you that swing states will still happen and that ultimately what happens is the Electoral College forces elections to come down to a few battleground states. UNT says, unfortunately, this is just politics. However, their counter-advocacy doesn't get rid of this either. Me and Jacob tell you that popular votes ultimately increase the amount of representation that happens within the United States during an election year. And they ignore Jacob's argumentation that these swing states create lower voter turnout, which the counter-advocacy can't solve because they still use electors. When you still have electors, you still have people who believe that their vote doesn't matter. Therefore, the counter-advocacy doesn't create a higher voter turnout like abolishing the Electoral College would. Second, we talk about representation, and they tell you that the counter-advocacy stalls. Unfortunately, this still isn't true. First, not all people that are counted in the census are eligible to vote or even choose to vote. In order to vote, you have to register first, and UNT's argumentation does not take that into account. People who are non-voters are choosing not to participate, and we have no idea what their voice is because they have not voted. The electors cannot accurately represent non-voters because they do not know where they stand, which means a popular vote would ensure that more people are represented in the United States and in democracy than before, and then are more representative than what the counter-advocacy statement gives you. And under the counter-advocacy that the negation gives you, this leads to things like fraud, since we're talking about the census. And unfortunately, if someone dies tomorrow, they would still be counted under the census, and they would still be counted as like a voter that the negation is trying to make count in the United States. Not only that, but the counter-advocacy actually does nothing for representation because the groups that cannot vote currently will still not be able to vote, which means electors don't know where they stand. So there's no more representation in the negation that they can give that the act doesn't give. You can look towards Jacob's third point where we tell you that the popular vote is something that the vast majority of Americans want. So if the vast majority of Americans feel like the popular vote is something that they want, we should go ahead and abolish the Electoral College. And getting rid of the winner-take-all approach that UNT proposes doesn't change the outcome of elections, nor does it actually do anything. As Jacob tells us in the first speech, electors can still vote whichever way they like. There are numerous federal laws that require elected officials and policymakers to follow ethics and transparency rules to ensure that the officials act in the public's interest. However, presidential electors have never been considered true elected officials or policymakers, so these laws do not cover them. Under UNT's counter-advocacy, faithless electors will still be allowed to vote whichever way they choose, which means even if you believe the argument that somehow abolishing the winner-take-all system part of the Electoral College, but keeping the electors is going to lead to an increase of representation. Unfortunately, because the electors can vote for whoever they want, that's not true. The counter advocacy attempts to fix a broken system. The states that they mention, thank you. The states that they mentioned have moved to abolish the winner-take-all system in their states, actually moved to have it work this way in order to protect the popular vote, not because they believed that the winner-take-all system was bad. The three reasons that Jacob gives in the first speech about swing states, representation, and how this is what the vast majority of constituents want shows that abolishing the Electoral College as a whole is still better than having any part of it exist. Under abolishing the Electoral College, you're going to see more representation because we use the popular vote and because we don't have electors standing in the way. Unfortunately, the counter advocacy that UNT gives you is not sufficient enough. And at the point where me and Jacob show you that this is what the vast majority of Americans want, we should always prefer situations in which we protect democracy and not demolish it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those remarks. And now I call upon Jose Sanchez to continue the case for the opposition.
All right, cool. The lesson for this debate is that currently alternatives already exist within the system in order to solve for the problems, which is why there is no use in actually abandoning the Electoral College. One thing that you have probably noticed throughout listening to these speeches is that the proposition team entirely focuses their reasons as to why we should abandon the Electoral College due to problems that merely already exist, or just due to merely problems that are extrinsic to the status quo, problems that are not actually inherent to the Electoral College, which is why we instead propose that although the Electoral College may be bad, this only suggests that these are extrinsic issues that should be fixed by imposing another reform, i.e. through actually doing this through a by-district basis rather than one that is entirely winner takes all, such as the status quo system that we have right now, which is why their argument about this counter advocacy essentially decreasing representation is entirely not true. They fail to actually take into account how the Electoral College is currently preserving specific groups of people, such as undocumented immigrants as well as felons, who literally cannot vote. Yes, who literally cannot vote right now because of the ways that, merely because of the ways of, because of those who cannot vote are not allowed to. The popular vote not only does not actually include their voices, but it actually excludes them through not prioritizing the Electoral College, which is why only through such a reform type basis can we actually solve for any of these issues such as misrepresentation. In order to put this counterplan into more specific context, for example, sorry, does somebody have a point of information?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Go ahead.
So counting these groups that can't vote, but not letting them vote, how is that more representative than having a popular vote?
Once again, our argument is that when these people are actually included into the electoral process, not only does this increase a state's like amount of electoral seats that they have, but there is a direct correlation with the amount of interest that these groups of people are actually represented in, i.e. that they actually have a voice, you know, in where they live. Like people are actually listening to them. We don't think that like just their existence is, you know, like sidelined in states like Texas. I think that probably like the immigration rights movement in Texas is a lot more active than it is in the North, for example. But in order to put this counter advocacy into more context, let's go ahead and use this as an example and say you have a roommate and maybe his name is Alexander De La Rosa. Y'all are deciding what to order from, you know, y'all's go to pizza place, Pizza Hut, because we all know that's like the most supreme pizza place. But your roommate is dead set on Wingstop, saying he's not feeling pizza really. But luckily, Pizza Hut has Wing Street, so we can both get what we want, right? Both pizza and wings. Our argument is that the counter advocacy is essentially this combination. So every state actually has a say in what they want. This specifically means that every state is essentially allocating their electoral votes on a by-district level based on the popular vote, which means that it's almost not different from the popular vote, which the proposition institutes, but it's actually better because it still utilizes the Electoral College by specifically including the popular vote by district, and therefore giving the rest of the two electoral seats that are decided by the Senate to the overall state or that is decided by the overall state popular vote, which essentially means that because the Electoral College is already set up to where everybody's states is essentially equally represented, it means that especially on a local level, these citizens and the people are still going to be more accurately represented rather than them doing things such as voting individually and completely excluding the voices of, their loved ones, for example, who either are criminal felons or are undocumented. But more specifically, they also attempt to say, or they attempt to give this one argument that the popular vote would essentially lead to a less polarized campaigning because it actually focuses people's interests, but this is entirely not true. Since not only are arguments about census already explained this insofar as how certain voices are excluded, but also is that the popular vote would only further encourage candidates to specifically campaign in certain areas that are more populated, such as California and Texas, in order to win the most seats. Under a by-district voting system, i.e. that through which we advocate through the counter plan, people are actually represented through every district, which means that there is no problem with even people who live in rural areas, for example, and they're actually represented because their vote matters and candidates actually have incentives to campaign in these areas. The popular vote just incentivizes candidates to vote for those areas which are more metropolitan, that actually have higher populations in order to win their votes. However, I think that the most important takeaway here is that all of the issues that the proposition outlines as to why the Electoral College are bad are essentially drops in the bucket. For example, they mention things such as faithless electors, but actually according to Hans Babowski, which is a researcher for the Heritage Foundation, states that these things are not actually really issues. He even outlines how in the 2016 election, for example, there was only 3 of those faithless electors, and ever since then there has been a Supreme Court that has already upheld the state's ability in order to nullify these votes so their electors can actually vote properly. This means that there are already incentives and rules in place that have happened since 2016 in order to solve for these issues, which is why the problem is not necessarily that the Electoral College is entirely bad and we have to essentially damn it, but rather that we have to fix the problems that the Electoral College currently has by instituting reform.
Thank you very much. Now, if everybody will click on their video again, we now have an opportunity. We'll now have an opportunity for you to give floor speeches. So if you want to give a floor speech, if you would raise your hand, or you can do it by clicking under the participants list. If you want to do that, then I will call on you and you will have 2 minutes to either speak for or against the topic. Okay? So who would like to give a short floor speech? And also, if you put it in gallery view as opposed to speaker view, it's a little bit easier for me to see. Thank you. No one wants to give a floor speech. Hi, Mr. Cisneros.
My audio is working okay, right?
You're fine. You're good.
So I would just like to give some of my thoughts on advocating for the government. So advocating for why the Electoral College should be abolished. I will be specifically talking about some arguments brought up. I specifically want to talk about the counter advocacy first. Just on my personal thoughts on what is going on, that I would kind of want to say that I personally believe that the counter advocacy might not actually solve. A key point that I would like to think too that kind of really persuaded me on this side was just understanding that these underrepresented groups that the negation brings up in their speech, is that they may not actually be represented even in the world of the counter advocacy brought up by the negation. They still may not constitutionally have the right to vote. The notion that it gives to me is that then if they don't really have the right to vote in the counter advocacy, then what really is the point? It kind of seems like it's just a power move for these states to gain more electoral college votes that mainly the dominant groups in their states previously can still advocate for. It's just kind of a power move for the states. As such, I would just believe then that the structural problems that the affirmative brings up as reasonings as to why we should abolish the Electoral College, such as it gives too much power to the swing states, influences elections too much through the swing states, still act as problems that the counter advocacy doesn't really solve. And then just one last point too about the affirmative is just understanding that currently the United States, unfortunately, does have one of the lowest voter turnouts across the globe when compared to other democratic nations. And then also one key fact that distincts ours from others is that the United States is one of the few that actually uses an electoral college system in its elections when compared to these other nations that practice free and fair elections.
Okay, and that's your time. Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to give a floor speech? A 2-minute floor speech from the floor? I'm not seeing any hands. Help me out here, I'm dying, come on. Where are our advocates? So the 4 debaters were that articulate that they left nothing left for you to say. Okay. Well, if there are no floor speeches, we will then begin with our rebuttals. Each side will have 1 rebuttal. It is a 4-minute speech. There are no points of information in the rebuttal. I would ask that you go back and click on that hide non-video participants again, please. There we go. Again, you have to hover over someone else and click hide non-video participants. Okay, excellent. All right. So now we'll begin our 2 rebuttals with the negative. Alex De La Rosa. You have 4 minutes, Alex.
Cool. So thank you. So I'd like to address the floor speech first, and like kind of. So the first argument I kind of want to present is just like a basic cost benefit analysis, right? Under the status quo, these people have 0 representation because of the way that the Constitution outlines who can and cannot vote. Our advocacy at least gives them some way to actually have an impact on the election, right? And to the representation point, because of the fact that these elections are done by on a district by district level, they're more likely to be represented because of the fact that our counter advocacy serves as local empowerment to these places, right? Because of the fact that these elections are more centered and local, right? They're more likely to be reflective of the general needs of that locality, right? And furthermore, right, the net benefit is also that a lot of these people who are in prison, right, are people who are people of color who have been affected by a racist criminal justice system, right? So because of that, and because of the fact of the ableism of the mentally incapacitated prohibition, right? We're actually giving these people some weight in the election, right? Even if they cannot vote, they can have some weight in the election. Under the affirmative proposition, this goes away completely, right? So moving on to like some of the general points that the affirmative makes, right? They say that the winner take all system gets in the way of the third party system, but this isn't exclusive to the Electoral College, right? In our counter advocacy, we're actually getting rid of the system, and because of the fact that it's done on a district by district level, third parties are now able to win electoral votes in the Electoral College if they manage to win a particular district. They say that. That there's going to be lower voter turnout because of the Electoral College, but as like my partner establishes, a lot of the problems that they bring up about the Electoral College aren't exclusive to the Electoral College itself, right? And the affirmative, like the proposition assumes that the lower voter turnout trends will continue if we adopt the counter advocacy, right? They're just saying that like because we have lower voter turnout now with the Electoral College, that even if we do a reform, that trend will stay the same. That argument doesn't hold up. They say that our representation doesn't solve because people can't vote and they're choosing not to participate. But for a lot of these people, they're legally restricted not to vote. And this has serious implications when it comes to things like racism, ableism, and other forms of nationalism that perpetuate violence against these people. Again, even in the counter advocacy, even if these people aren't able to vote, they at least have some weight in the election because their populations impact how the census is conducted and how electoral votes are allocated on a state by state basis. Again, they bring up the point about faithless electors, but as my partner brings up, this is a pretty much a non-issue when it comes to elections, right? There have already been laws in place to force states to actually, like to tie their electors to the popular vote, right? So this problem, again, is also not unique to the Electoral College. So basically, every critique that they bring about the Electoral College has to do with other things outside of the Electoral College. If you vote for for our counter advocacy, right, you get people who otherwise would not have any weight on the election actually having some weight in the election, even if they cannot physically vote. Two, we get rid of this problem of people winning the Electoral College and not winning the popular vote because electoral votes are actually represented within the Electoral College. So for these reasons, we urge that you vote for the counter advocacy and the opposition. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those remarks. And now Jacob Everett will conclude the debate.
All right. Before I start, I just want to give one last thanks to everyone for coming out. All right, but first I'm going to start off with just telling you why you're going to be voting to abolish the Electoral College. The biggest reason is that it creates a low voter turnout. Now, the only argument that they have on this is that this is something that will happen post the Electoral College, but you can look at the NPR article that I even cited that tells you specifically why the Electoral College is the problem here. There were three reasons that I outlined. The first is that voters in swing states are told to vote more than voters who aren't in swing states, i.e. in places like Florida, there's more ads on TV, there's more door knockers, and there's more just tactics that are used to increase the amount of people that show up at the polls. And the second reason that's specifically because the Electoral College creates swing states. The second reason that I point out why the Electoral College creates low voter turnout is also because the swing states may create laws to make it more convenient for people to show up to the polls. Things like same-day voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, and even mail-in voting has historically been reserved to swing states and swing states exclusively. They don't tell you that, we're telling you specifically that this is because swing states were created. And the only reason that we have swing states is because of the Electoral College. Don't buy into any of their arguments that say that any of this happens post-implementation or post-abolition of the Electoral College. All of this is stuff that we're seeing specifically because swing states exist. The third reason why I told you that low voter turnout is created because of the Electoral College is that voters are more likely to be discouraged from voting in non-swing states because voters are less likely to show up to the ballot box if they're sure that the electors are going to vote one way or the other. I.e., someone who lives in Texas might not show up to the ballot box to vote for a Democrat because they know that Texas is going to vote Republican. It has historically always voted Republican. There's no getting out of this. All of this is created specifically because the Electoral College exists and uses its power to create swing states, which are bad and they cause low voter turnout. You're also going to vote on the idea that a lack of representation is less democratic. Now, they tried to get us on this by saying that they represent more voters in their counter advocacy, but this isn't true for a few reasons. The first of which is that these voters that they're talking about literally cannot vote. All that the census does is it counts them as there, and that tells the state how many electors they're allowed to have. That doesn't necessarily mean that voters are gonna get that their vote is gonna count, or that how they want to vote is gonna count. They specifically even pointed out undocumented immigrants as one of the groups that is affected by the Electoral College and benefits from it. But this is obviously not true because Trump is the president. He won the Electoral College votes, but not the popular vote. And he built his entire campaign off of the idea that undocumented immigrants were a problem that needed to be solved. They aren't going to win that undocumented immigrants are going to be more properly represented because we literally saw 4 years ago that they weren't properly represented through the Electoral College. And the next problem with the idea that the Electoral College gives more representation is the faithless voters argument that I brought up. You're going to look at the Brookings Institute article that I referenced several times in my first speech. In this, West points out that faithless voters were upheld in court as to being able to vote however they want. 18 states currently have no laws on electors, and they only get a fine if they're caught voting a way that's different from what they're supposed to do. This is less democratic by far, and it doesn't properly show representation. You're also going to vote on us because we have shown through a poll taken last year that more Americans favor the abolition of the Electoral College in a popular vote.
And that's your time. Thank you all very much for a good and thoughtful discussion. I'm going to release the poll now. And so you can vote to either vote to abolish the Electoral College or vote to not abolish the Electoral College and go with the proportional representation that UNT advocated. Just want to say while all of y'all are voting that Dr. Lane and I have talked about getting together and doing this type of debate for a couple of years, several years now. And, it took a pandemic to make us do it, I guess. But hopefully it'll be the first of many that we get to do, and maybe include some of the other schools as well. Brian, anything else that you want to add while people are casting their votes?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I loved your comment. It takes a pandemic.
Right.
Who knows what a presidential election could lead us to do? Oh my God.
I know, huh? Oh my gosh.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the debaters, though. Thanks very much, all of you. A fantastic job.
Did a great job. 27 of 30 precincts are in. I guess I don't. Are y'all voting for yourselves here? No, I'm not. Okay. I guess we have it all. Anybody else still need to vote? Nope. Okay, so by a vote of 23 to 5, we are abolishing the Electoral College. Thank you all so very, very much for coming out tonight. I appreciate North Texas for joining us in this endeavor with great appreciation, right, Brian? Thank you all very much. Y'all have a good, pleasant evening.
If you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the museum by visiting www.lbjmuseum.com to make a one-time donation or become a member. And friend us on Facebook to keep up with events and learn about this day in history.